So 1 moment.
There you go.
All right, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Yes, awesome. So let me start the presentation from the beginning. Okay, so I'm hoping everyone is seeing the proper screen. Are you seeing the control panel, like where my mouse is now? Okay, so let me try and switch the screen to the other one. This one. Okay, how about this? Shake your head no if you don't see the arrows to control. So it should look like just the presentation screen. Okay. I may have asked a strange question, but I think it's good. So today's topic is going to be what it takes to learn a language, which is the business we're in. But I think a lot of the topics we're going to cover today are going to be universal for any kind of skill development. And you'll see more about what I mean in a second. So moving forward, you've seen this slide before, but I like to bring it up every time because this is something that we're actively doing. It's something that we're actively increasing now. Since last time, I increased the number of minutes I taught online by 5,000 minutes. So I'm hoping that from that experience, I asked the students, what actually works for you in terms of learning a language? What was the progression from the beginning to where you are now, and what helped you? So where we are in our 6-month program is we're in the 2nd month, which is the topic of what actually are we involved in doing in this language learning sphere. What is the size of the content we're teaching, and how is it practical to help a student navigate this long journey to reach their goal? So next month, we'll talk about how online tutoring factors into this process, which is basically what we're going to have to focus on going forward, considering that many students in the world are not in the United States. Our organization likes to help people within our community, but what we want to do is help people in general. And if we can reach as many people who are willing as possible, that's an increased benefit. So we are hoping to expand our online offerings beyond just our community offerings. So let's talk about the content of today's presentation. There's 6 subtopics, but I numbered them starting with 0, which will be motivation. And the reason I numbered it 0 is because beneath anything else that you do when you try to gain a skill, in this case, we're talking about learning a language, it all proceeds from your desire or your necessity to acquire this skill. Without that, you wouldn't engage in the activity, and without it, you wouldn't continue in the activity. That's relevant to tutors because tutors function as a coach and someone who provides encouragement to their student. So if you are considering what will guarantee the success of my student, what will guarantee that they achieve this goal more or less independently, because you can't learn for them, you can only help them learn. What will help them independently go through this process of learning is preserving that fire inside that will move them forward. So moving from motivation, there's 2 basic aspects about training in general. One is continuity, the other is intensity. We'll talk more about that. Then we'll look at the small granular details of what is involved in language learning. So I've called that topic mechanics. There's 6 skills: vocabulary, grammar, and then what we commonly think about, the 4 skills of reading and writing, listening and speaking. We'll think about what we can do to improve those. Finally, we'll talk about an advanced topic, which is basically after your training has progressed or you're in the habit of maintaining a sustainable and regular training schedule, how can you ensure that you don't get stuck? That's topic number 4. And number 5, basically putting it all together, how can the learning process be evolved beyond simple skill mastery? So I hope you're excited. If anyone has any questions, just, wave your hands and I'll stop. So 0, motivation, ambition, and necessity. I actually wanted some participation at this slide, so I'm kind of sad that everyone's muted. But I'll answer my own questions. Why would someone want to learn English? This usually deals with the topic of necessity. For the literacy volunteers of Southern Connecticut. Oh, I think we've been unmuted, so maybe we can get some
Yes.
participation. So I'll go to Wendy. She's next down in my video view. Wendy, why do you think someone would want to learn English?
So is this question for people who live in this country, or are you just talking about globally?
I'd actually like to consider it globally, but I like that you made the distinction. Looks like she's been muted again. It's too bad. Maybe I can unmute you. Unmute. There we go. Okay. So Wendy, are you unmuted? No, you're back to being muted. Okay. I think there's like conflict
Okay.
between me and Tammy trying to control who's muted and who's
Yes,
not.
I think I'm back. Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, I was simply saying that English is such a widely spoken language, and it's a language that's used in a good deal of international commerce and industry, that that in and of itself would be, I think, a primary motivating factor to want to speak English.
That is exactly right. So yeah, there is that necessity of the economic benefit. So for historical reasons, currently the language of commerce is English. So people who want to participate in the global economy will want to improve their English skills. Again, because of economic conditions, many people want to move to the United States where they speak English. So there's that necessity and that economic advancement aspect that motivates someone to acquire this skill of English. But many people I encounter are just interested in learning English for mostly like in a hobby or an interest motivated reason.
Mhm.
And that deals really with personal ambition. Like, what does
Mhm.
someone want to accomplish in life? There are still people who will dedicate thousands and thousands of hours to mastering a dead language. And maybe they have a very fundamental reason for doing that. For example, if someone was very interested in reading the original text of, say, the New Testament, they would have to learn ancient Greek in order to do it. And if they have that fundamental desire to do this, it's sufficient to go through all of that effort to achieve their goal.
Mhm.
So I really believe that what you can accomplish in language learning or any skill will proceed from motivation.
Mhm.
And as a tutor, you can encourage your student. So consider that. Uh, if there's any sign of discouragement or stress in the learning process, uh, part of your job is to mm, not alleviate that stress, but turn that stress into more motivation. So you are feeling stressed because this is a big task, but it's a big task with a huge reward. So think about what is the benefit on the other side. All right, so moving on, I like to think about training from a sports perspective. You might not be able to tell, but I used to do sports, and a lot of how I look at training uh, comes from an athletic perspective. Also, I have a perspective of injury. So I used to do sports, but I ended up stopping because of injuries in the training process. So it taught me a lot about what is sustainable in training in general. And even though you might think that you can't injure your mind by studying, you can apply a similar idea. And we'll talk about that in a second. So when you are trying to acquire any skill, in this case, we're thinking about language, you should have a schedule where basically the training from one session is going to carry over to the next session. You can have a great class once in a language, but if you don't have another class again for 3 years, really, you're going to have to start over after that. So this idea of continuity is really central, where continuity simply means that the frequency of training is frequent enough that each session builds on the last. There isn't stagnation, it's more like stacking of what happens each time. Now, depending on how much time you have available to you, you could do more or less training. Most people who are engaged in language learning are adults, or even if they're children, they have a full academic plate in front of them. They have a full, if they're a working adult, they have their families and their jobs also in front of them. So they have a time constraint on how much training they can actually do. And you should not attempt to do more training than will interfere with your other activities. Therefore, you should choose a sustainable portion. Uh, Later on, we'll see that probably that's at least 30 minutes. So if you're trying to learn a language, you should do 30 minutes at least per day, or the equivalent time per week. 30 minutes per day times 7 is about 3.5 hours. So this aspect here, prioritization, is that same thing. Don't let your training for language learning interfere with what's important in your life, your academic progress, your career progress. Uh, just mentioning time horizon. Because of the size of the project, you have to expect that the result you want is not going to come immediately. It's going to take many years of training sessions to achieve practical skill. So looking at the two types of athletes we have on the slide, we have a strength athlete and a endurance athlete. Neither of them was born with the ability that they're exhibiting here. It was the result of accumulated effort over a long period of time. Uh, Language is actually kind of a fusion of the two concepts. Uh, the process itself is extended, so it's kind of like an endurance process. You have to maintain your training for a very long period of time without giving up. That's like running a marathon. At the same time, you are going to have to exercise your brain to try and think in a new way, to try and express logical propositions in a new grammar, in a new language. In my opinion, that requires heavy lifting of the brain. So you will have to build up mental muscles, like our strength athlete on the top. So uh, I heard a famous metaphor once about intensity in training. It was that if you had a piece of wood, this is from Napoleon Hill, so I'll give credit where credit's due. Napoleon Hill said, if you have a piece of wood and the sun shines on that wood for 1,000 years, the wood will never catch fire. But if you have a magnifying glass and you concentrate the sunlight through the magnifying glass onto the wood, you can burn a hole in minutes. So that's the same thing you need to think about when you're training. Yes, you need a sustainable schedule. Yes, you need to do something that's not too much, so you won't interfere with your life. That's injury. So you want to not do too much that you injure yourself. But at the same time, you have to strike that balance where you actually are burning a hole to the next level. How do you do that? You're not lifting weights on a bar, you're doing something mental. So you do this with variety of inputs. You do this by actually trying to use it. Language is a communication tool. So you have to try to communicate. And usually something progressively more difficult with your training sessions. Over and above that, I do believe you need to control yourself. So that's why I have focus and concentration in red. This is probably the most difficult thing for me. But there was a famous person who I don't know his name, so this is a very loose anecdote, who mastered an incredible number of languages, like 17 languages. And they asked him, how was this possible for you? You could say maybe he had talent, but he said he didn't do more than 15 minutes per day. And if he did more than 15 minutes, he said my brain was kind of not as fresh. I didn't have the same sharpness. Basically, it means he concentrated very hard for 15 minutes and didn't waste any time. That's the same thing as the sun shining on the wood. He didn't spend 3 hours studying language kind of, with a blurry picture of what was going on. He focused very intensely and memorized a piece in 15 minutes. So there are methods to improve concentration. I'm not going to talk about them today, but if you see on TV things, people talk about exercises that can improve your memory. I think it actually should be incorporated into mental training, maybe for students, maybe for adults, just like going to the gym. And I think if you add that to your language training, you will make progress because you won't waste as much time in a session. All right. Any questions? Just raise your hands. Okay, let's move on. The question is, how long are you going to have to keep this up? Because maybe you're not going to finish on your timetable. I like to think about progress from a plant perspective. If I plant a seed in the ground, I can't force the growth. Or if I do force the growth, usually it's not a complete mature plant. There are like ornamental plants that are basically, their purpose is kind of like superficial. They're not, they didn't reach their full potential. It's the same thing with these learning projects. If you plant the seed in the ground, you have to wait until it fully develops in order to reap the benefit. You can't pick the fruit at an early stage. So same thing, you're wondering, why have I been at this so long and I don't have any benefit yet? The answer is you're still maturing, right? You have to wait until you have finished before you can experience the benefit. that encourages my students. So I don't know how you feel about it, but when you just have to be patient, you have to wait until the full process of learning is fulfilled. All right, moving on. So this section is the mechanics section of learning a language. There are 6 skills: the visual group, which is reading and writing; the auditory group, which is listening and speaking; and what I've called the systems group, vocabulary and grammar. Vocabulary in English you might think of as being more like just information. It's like the name of an action or the name of an object. In other languages, it might be more flexible. Like in Russian, for example, there are 6 cases. So every noun has 6 forms, which are similar. You can probably tell that this is the noun, this is one particular noun. But the grammar is fused into how the word sounds and how the word is spelled.
I think that's quarter of 1, okay?
All right. So the question is, what is the most important thing in this chart? If you think the most important thing here is writing, please raise your hand on the screen. Anybody? How about speaking? It's 1. We have Nancy.
I don't know.
Also Wendy.
Maybe.
Yeah. In fact, I agree that it is speaking, and I'll tell you why. So when you're training, you don't have forever to train. You have different types of exercises you can do. Going back to our comparison with athletes, there's something called a bang for your buck exercise. It's an exercise that, based on the amount of time you spend doing it, you get a huge benefit. For a squat, you end up training a large number of muscles at the same time. If you have a weakness, maybe you have a shoulder injury, yes, probably you're going to have to do something focused and small. But if you had only one thing to do and you wanted to make progress, you would probably choose that exercise that works the most muscles at the same time. This is why speaking is the central unit of language learning. So if you're going to do nothing else, do 30 minutes of speaking, and eventually that will be the most efficient way for you to learn a language. You could spend 10 years reading, and then you won't develop the sound system to speak. You won't be able to recognize what other people are saying when they talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
So that act of speaking and communicating orally is the way, is the key. That's the squat. You can't succeed without it. However, you'll notice that below speaking on the section that says which exercise gives you the most bang for your buck, direct exam prep, I also mentioned. The reason being that some people, say you're in Vietnam, your salary may be tied to an exam score. So if you can prove that you can score so-and-so on the TOEIC exam, then that actually is going to have an immediate benefit for you now, rather than maybe later on speaking, which is a very vast exercise. We'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, one more comparison. I said if there's a weakness in your shoulder, for example, you can do a small exercise that's going to fix it. That probably has a place in training also, but you have to recognize where your student is or where you are as a learner. What do I need to focus on now, which is going to accelerate my progress? Okay. Any questions? All right, moving on. So, bang for your buck. The answer is speaking. That is the activity that's going to give you the most benefit and will actually bring you to your goal. without fail. The reason is you are getting input from your interlocutor, the person you're speaking with, so you will always be receiving information. At the same time, you are doing this in real time. You're not putting any delay. You're not thinking for a few minutes about what you want to say. That adds the element of intensity to the training, which is necessary. Think about shining the sun on the wood. You need it to be intense enough to make progress. So the time pressure and the communication goal is achieved in speaking. And you're speaking to communicate, which is the purpose of language. When the brain learns, the brain forms connections. And you can form connections which have no meaning, basically they're random. You can have connections which are in an order but don't have a function. So that's why under number 3, I have the first point, isolated data is inert. If a student spends a year learning English vocabulary, basically they've downloaded isolated data, which is not incorporated into any kind of functional practice. So the experience of speaking and learning words at the same time incorporates in your memory the word and its use, the word and the sentence you said. That's the way to build an English speaking machine in your brain. Over and above that, speaking today is actually a very flexible and easy thing to do. Because of the internet, you can usually find a whole world of people who are willing to speak with you and share their culture, which means that you can make friends. You can find people who otherwise you never would have met. And that provides a lot of flexibility for who you can ask for help in your language learning journey. Someone who's a good match with you, someone who's good at correcting grammar, someone who's just really interesting to talk to. So I think today speaking is the most important thing and also one of the easiest things to do because it's fun. So let's move on. We're going to put it all together. There's 2 sides to the language learning process. Here I've represented them with the ocean, which is huge, you can't even see the end, and the bricklaying, step by step. Again, this is kind of like the parallel between bang for your buck and the small exercise. The exercise that corrects or builds up something that's missing, and the other thing which is what you really need to do. You have a destination in the future. If you want to get there, you're going to have to cross the ocean. So, surprise slide. We always talk about the process of language learning as if it's already started, and in most cases it has. As a child, most students have probably entered a class where they started learning English, they know a few phrases. But if you could start from the ideal location, because your initial conditions will affect your journey, my opinion is that if you can learn the sound system and start speaking as soon as possible, that will accelerate your process. I would say about 20 times. And that's not a number I'm just pulling out of my head. The process for learning language is usually about 10 years for most people I speak to. But I think if you actually start with the sound system and begin speaking within the first month, you can have competence in communication within 6 months. So if it only takes you 6 months instead of 10 years, that's like 1/20th. That's pretty good. How can this be achieved? I want to mention it briefly, before we move on. There's a method of teaching language called the audiolingual method, but it requires that the participants, the teacher has to know both languages. It's the only way. So the student is trying to learn English, for example, and say the student's Japanese. The teacher in this situation has to be able to speak both languages. What they do is they say the one phrase in the native language, and then they say the equivalent phrase in the language they're trying to learn. For example, we all speak English, and I would ask in Japanese, what does that mean? どういう意味ですか? What does that mean? So the Japanese speaker would hear the original version, どういう意味ですか? And then they would hear the English phrase, what does that mean? So they create a link between the two phrases in their mind, and they will say it with correct pronunciation. So this is the start. I encountered this method when I was trying to learn Russian for the first time. I started with a textbook, and I realized within the first chapter that I have no idea how to say these words. And I knew that my pronunciation would be completely wrong, and that I wouldn't recognize what people were saying to me. So I have to start with the sounds. And I stick by that. If you want to learn a language, start with the sound system. Learn phrases, and then try and speak. If you know how to say, how do I say this? You can ask a speaker, and they can tell you. So you now have the principal tool to build your language. How do I say this? Как сказать? That's Russian. Or なんと意味ですか? I've only just started Russian, Japanese. But yeah, if you can ask how to say something, then you have that fundamental piece. All right. Any questions? Okay, moving on. So where does that lead us? This was from last month's presentation also, but it's the same concept. If you can do nothing else, start with 30 minutes of speaking. That's the most fundamental element. And if you can increase your training, say you have an hour, the other half of that equation you should fill with that bricklaying idea. Speaking is getting out there and communicating. That's going onto the ocean. Text-based input is targeting some weakness that you have and studying it incrementally. If you can do that, you can combine it with what you're practicing when you're speaking. You can ask questions about what you're learning, what you're not sure about, to the tutor who's helping you speak. Those two processes together is what's going to create a cohesive language skill, because you're starting from the practical use and you're starting from the whole system, from a textbook, for example. So if you have more time than 1 hour, say you have 90 minutes, over and above the two input methods, speaking and working through a textbook, I recommend review, because review will solidify what you've learned. Just like for this presentation, if you heard it the first time, that's great. But within an hour, you might say, well, what was all that? That was a lot of content. If you go through some notes, or if you see the slides and summary, that reawakens the information in your mind and helps transfer it from your short-term memory into your long-term memory. And if you have more time than that, you can just increase the proportions of any of the individual pieces: text-based input, speaking, or review. I also have here extreme methods, and that's whatever you want it to be. I think last time I mentioned the student who learned English by watching 6 hours of English TV for 5 months. And so that's how he learned English. But not everyone has time to do that. If you do, by all means. Okay. So, final chapter. This is a learning technique called creative restructuring. Again, the principle of learning in your mind is building connections. So how can you improve the connections for things that you've already learned? If you can see the image in the background, that is a plateau. In training, a plateau is when you're doing everything right. You have a sustainable schedule. You have regularity with intensity. There's nothing wrong, but you're still not making progress. This is when you have to consider creative ways to mix up your training. So I have here 4 suggestions. One is teaching. We'll go into that almost immediately. Another is composition. And by composition, I mean writing. Second to last is refresh methods. And number 4, targeted advancement. So we'll see what that is. All right, so teaching. The process of teaching is basically to take what you've been studying and communicate it in a clear way. Sometimes we do better or worse than usual, but it's the practice of helping someone else understand it. As Einstein said, if you can't explain something clearly enough that a 6-year-old could understand it, you don't understand it well enough yourself. And I agree, if you have clarity, then you know exactly who you are, you know exactly what you believe, you know exactly why something is some way in a language. It's kind of an uncomfortable position when you're a language teacher and someone asks you, why is it this way? And you have no idea. You're kind of just standing on it. No, that's just the way we do it. When you have a high level of clarity, it represents that your knowledge and understanding is complete about a subject. Again, you're going through the process of communication. So if you're teaching a language, this is seeing things from that angle. You fill in the gaps when you teach. So the student asks you a question you don't expect, and maybe you have the answer, but you have to say, it's this way because of this. Thank you for asking. And there's a huge benefit to teaching, in my opinion. It costs you nothing. Depending on how many people are listening to you, what you are transferring, if it's valuable, is multiplied by that number of people. So information is a pretty cool thing. It's not like building something. Building something requires like the same unit of material. Information multiplies infinitely, just depending on who hears it. Okay. So composition. We had a presentation on writing about 2 months. Actually, I think we skipped a month because of the virus. 3 months ago. That was the benefit of writing for language practice. The idea was if you write something to practice your language, you use your existing knowledge to create a tangible product. That you can look at and correct. For example, one student I recommended recently to use a thesaurus. If you need to improve your vocabulary, you can speak English and write English well enough, write something, and then now write it better. Use a thesaurus to find words that you didn't know before. At the same time, the teacher can help you. So if you bring your composition to a teacher, they can advise you on how to form a natural sentence, how the native speaker would say something. If you're a master, it's a I recommend it. Writing a book about like what you're a master of, or maybe a biography of your life, because people can benefit. So my favorite autobiography is the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. So he systematized what he did in his life, and a lot of people, after reading his work, said, "Wow, uh, now I understand how you can basically live your life sustainably and manage your time well. I could try it also." So composition, highly recommend it. Refresh methods is something really interesting. If you've been involved with the language for a long time, you might want to think of some creative way to review it without going through the same thing again. So I have this problem right now, and I've been studying Russian for about 3 years. And to do it, I made these flashcards. And I'd love to go through them again, but I feel like it'd be boring. So instead of learning the basics of Russian again this way, because I feel like I'm standing on quicksand. It's like it's been 3 years since I did this, so now I kind of want to like go over everything I studied. What I'm trying to do is to use basic Japanese to learn basic Russian, because simple enough, you open up the textbook and you go step by step. But instead of learning it using my English, I'll learn it using my Russian. So you build up those one-to-one relationships between the two languages.
Hmm.
I just give this as an example. If you need to restudy something, consider not going back to the beginning, but going forward in a way that will show you the beginning again. Uh, I don't know if I'm going to learn Korean, but I know that Korean and Japanese are similar. So always think about what you can do in the future. If I want to continue to practice Japanese, why not use Korean to practice Japanese? It's a possibility. So that leads us into our final point, which is uh, targeted advancement. Instead of learning another language which might have no point, if you want to advance your career, uh, consider using your language to learn that new skill. So I talked to some scientists online who are trying to improve their English. In order to learn more English related to science, they will read all the papers that have been published in the past few months in order to practice English. So they're staying current with what's happening in science, but at the same time practicing their English or using their English to do it. If you have a particular job skill, maybe a software skill, don't buy the book in your first language, buy the book in your second language and work through it. So that's speaking in terms of languages. But like I said, I think these principles are kind of fundamental to training in general. So if you have a goal, make sure you preserve your motivation and choose some sustainable schedule. Don't do it to the extent that you're going to injure your life or your body, but do it to the extent that it's intense enough to make progress. After that, look at the big picture and the small picture. If you attack it from the two angles, I don't really think you can fail, especially if you choose something that gives you a huge bang for your buck. For language that's speaking, if it's physical training, you want to do a compound exercise that uses a lot of muscles. And if you start to stagnate in your progress, just try some creativity. One of the best ways to review something is to try and teach it. And with that, that's our presentation. So, any questions?
Yeah, I have a question for you.
All right, Larry.
Here. Okay. if I speak French, which I don't, let's say I speak French very well and
Mhm.
English, should I gravitate more towards students who speak French, or does it make no difference what their primary language is?
If you're trying to make money, you might be competitive if you speak French, because there is an online, for this industry, there is an online marketplace. And if you do too, it will be a big benefit. Uh, if you think that speaking French helps you communicate better with your students, probably that would be the case if the student is beginner. So you might be able to help beginner students in French. But in my opinion, if you can watch your language closely enough, even in English, you can communicate with someone who has a very basic understanding. A lot of information is conveyed with the face, with the tone of voice. And uh, if you have Google Translate, you can kind of use it to improvise that audiolingual method I mentioned before. If you can type in the phrase in Translate and then show them, you can say it in English, like say, which is your city? Like sometimes I get students from Saudi Arabia who don't speak English, and I say, which city are you from? And they're like, what? So I type it, translates to Arabic, and I say, see, which city are you from? Oh, Riyadh. Okay, it's a good question. Uh, Anyone else? Just by a show of hands, has anyone tried learning a language previously? One?
Well,
Everybody?
in school we probably did. We took Spanish or French or something like that. Most
Yeah.
of us.
So it's a marathon. I know you didn't forget what you learned. You have it in your brain somewhere. But to finish the language, it took you a long time. Or if you didn't finish, it's because you didn't preserve that continuity. So if you want to, in science, if you have electrons orbiting around the electron can receive energy continually. But if it's not sufficient to go up a level on the orbitals, it won't go up. I think it's the same thing for English. You have to do something to a point where you reach that next level. Then you don't lose it. So that's an aspect I didn't mention in continuity. You have to do something until you get to a certain point, and then you get stuck there. And then you can go up a little more. Right. So I don't have a time display. Looks like we're good. All right, Patricia.
Well, I always harken back to my experience with the MLA program in high school. And I won't tell you how many years ago that was, because I learned Spanish via conversations, which I memorized.
Interesting.
Then, at the same time, we were introduced to the written word there.
Huh.
And as I took the 3 years, it went a little bit higher. To this day, even though I hadn't used the language, as soon as I started hearing people conversing in Spanish, the grammar went.
Wow.
Without having spent a lot of time learning that this is the past perfect, this is the future perfect.
Yeah. So you went from the conversation, you had like the full system, like memorized.
Because I remembered how it was expressed in the conversation.
Very nice. Was it audio that you memorized?
Okay. It was a combination. Yes, it was record. We had it back in those days. We used records, and then we may have used tape. And then in the classroom, we might have used tapes as well as having the printed word.
Very nice. Yeah. So again, if I could recommend a way to start, and I think Patricia's story confirms it, start with the speaking. If it's the sound system, that's fine. If you can find a tutor, that's fine also. Also, I asked my students today about this presentation because I wanted their input. This was true for me also. We were reluctant to start investing money in the process because we thought we could save money by studying harder individually. For me, that went on for 3 years before I tried speaking Russian. And so even though, yes, I didn't spend money for 3 years, I do realize now how much further I would be if I had tried to ask a tutor for help online. For English, a lot of people have the advantage because organizations like our organization will offer teaching assistance for free. If you want to go the other way, you're kind of going against gravity, like trying to learn Russian. You might say, what's the economic benefit there? That's where personal passion comes in. In that case, yes, you kind of do have to grease the wheels with a subscription to some kind of online tutor service, maybe. But they're not expensive. So that's my thing about that. If you're going to invest thousands of hours in something, consider what dollar value could actually reduce that, so you're not spending so much valuable time. All right. Any other questions? All right, terrific. So thanks everybody for coming today.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Great
Thank you.
slides.
Yes, thank you very much. It's good to see everybody. Thanks for
to
coming,
see
Larry
you.
and Patricia, some newcomers. I can't see who else is in the room. Let me stop screen sharing. There we go. Cool. I guess that's everybody. So I'm going to end the meeting, and I'll see you
Okay.
guys in 1 month.
Thank
Great.
you. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
Thank
See
you,
you in a
Tim.
month.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.